You built nothing, Mark. You're the family joke, Derek snarled, loud enough for the whole dining room to lean in, and the back of my throat went dry as my daughter Emma froze with a fork halfway to her mouth and my wife, Laura's knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. My name is Mark Riley. I'm 42 from Columbus, Ohio. And in the same breath, I thought of the one thing no one suspected I had tucked away, an old digital backup and a patience that counted like a ledger, because even as the laughter rolled like sleigh bells around me, I felt a cold, small thing settle inside my ribs that was not entirely grief, and I registered the pecan pie on the platter. Grandma June's recipe card folded under the tin like a promise, the blue enamel rim dented from years of holiday wars. The smell of cinnamon and molasses, a memory everyone else mistook for comfort, while Derek's words tasted like lemon on my tongue. The room reacted. Aunt Carol hissed and covered her mouth. Cousin Tom looked away with the disappointment of someone watching an overdue car crash, and children behind us pressed palms to their faces like curtains between acts. And I stood in the floodlight of that shame, because Emma was watching, because I wanted her to see something steadier than a man broken on a holiday table. And Derek, my brother, Derek Riley, kept going, fingers stabbing the air, him proud and loud. He said the things the gossip had chewed for months into dry pulp, that I had mismanaged the catering accounts, that I'd been cut out of Riley and Sons because I couldn't keep pace, that my wife's quiet jokes about cutting back were proof I was slipping, that our mortgage was a candle at both ends, and I was the one who'd melted it down. My voice wanted to scramble up from my chest and be loud enough to fight him, but the first thing that came out was my name said, without the armor of anger, a flat, unadorned self-introduction that no one can take back once it's been spoken into a room full of witnesses. The secret advantage I hinted at, then, an offhand line about, I keep copies of everything, sounded like a dare and like a lullaby all at once, but I said it so casually that Derek's smirk widened, like someone who thinks they've already won the bet, and that bets are just a way to watch someone else's collapse. I remember the clatter of a dropped spoon, the way the chandelier caught on Laura's wedding band and made it flare. I remember thinking of the blue enamel pie tin, how Grandma June used to thumb its rim and tell us that tradition is how we hold our heads when the wind gets mean. The accusation burned a path through the room, a public wound, and I felt both the rawness of humiliation and the odd, fizzing clarity that comes when something long ignored stirs in the bone. The kind of readiness that shows itself in men who have been put in a corner and have nowhere to go but forward. Derek named witnesses, other relatives who had nodded and given it shape, and people clucked, and the air filled with the familiar slow justice of gossip. And I knew in the way I always know the outcome of a game of cards I've played 1,000 times that I couldn't answer with heartfelt pleas or a list of small, earnest facts. I needed leverage, not apologies. My reaction was surgical. I took the pie tin, its enamel cool beneath my palm, and told Emma to go to the car and wait with Laura. My voice was a thread, but the instruction landed. And as I rose, I locked eyes with Derek, and he read the movement as defeat. The world moved in the hurry of a camera lens. People shifting, chairs scraping, someone whispering, "Mark, don't." The fork sliding across a china plate like a miniature train. Before I walked out into the cold November air, I let one thing hang. Not a plea and not an explanation, but a tiny, sharp cliffhanger of possibility, an unresolved sentence in front of witnesses who would carry it home. I said, "If you think this is the end, you forgot that I understand ledgers, and ledgers don't lie." The porch light cut my face into two, and the wind smelled sharp like cider, and the parking lot was a grid of truck headlights and the kind of cold that made your teeth ache. I walked to the car with the blue tin balanced like a trophy and my hands didn't shake. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I didn't shout, didn't smash plates, didn't pull out receipts in front of great-aunt witnesses. I left the theater of family to its own devices and moved into the engineering of quiet things. A downloaded file from an old shared drive, a timestamp on an email no one expected I'd saved, a screenshot I'd once taken in a moment of paranoia that now looked like premonition. The first quotable thing that rose when I climbed into the car wasn't bitter. Pride is the quiet debt men pay when they forget their balance. It was the philosophy I fed myself in the dark hours, a single line I kept as an anchor, and it steeled me as I drove away from the dining room. The house disappearing behind a halo of hedges and porch light, like a photograph whose edges were already softening. I drove to the diner where my father had taken me when I'd been a boy so the coffee would smell the same, where highway radios and greasy menus make men feel like they are still connected to some bigger plan. I sat in a booth and opened my laptop and let the blue enamel tin sit beside my coffee like a talisman. I pulled up the old shared folders and found the receipts, the small betrayals in neat columns like a confession. Derek had signed away minutes and hours on his way to making himself into the family hero. A donation here, a loan there, a series of electronic nudges that in the daylight looked neat until you noticed a clause missing, the exact clause that the partnership agreement required for any transfer of assets, unanimous written consent, and a notarized signature. There it was, a clause Derek had ignored when he filed the transfer to the catering arm to a man in the city who had called him visionary. He had assumed family could be elbowed aside because family is soft. He'd assumed no one would comb through the paperwork. I made copies, deep copies, invoices, a misfiled email with a timestamp that didn't match the stated time of the transfer, a chat screenshot where Derek's tone had been careless. Mark will never see this coming, and a file of voice memos Derek had sent a colleague bragging about his move. I printed everything, wrapped it in a plain envelope, and signed it with the kind of calmness that comes from being able to plan 2 steps ahead. In the diner, between sips of coffee that tasted like old coins, I called Tom, the cousin who ran a V for the town hall, the quiet man who always sat in the back taking notes, and I asked him one thing: can you be there on Saturday when they give Derek the Community Leadership Award? Tom's voice was low and surprised, but he said yes because Tom owed the family favors and because Tom saw the tilt in my voice and didn't need more detail. The plan pivoted from humiliation to exposure, from wounded pride into a slow, clinical unraveling that would be public and precise. I started to feel the shape of it as a machine. A viral post to make the chat reach beyond our town, a legal nudge that would set a clerk's pen to re-examining paperwork, a community that would demand answers when they discovered Derek had quietly sold the family recipe and the brand of our small catering arm to an outsider without the unanimous okay. I didn't want to destroy him for cruelty alone. I wanted justice for the ledger and for Emma's clean face at the table, but I also wanted to make sure the lesson cut where it would be understood, in public, in the places where his pride had tried to be built. I tested the screens, checked the timestamps again, and slipped the printed screenshots into the blue enamel tin symbol and evidence folded together. And I thought once of Grandma June's hands, the way she'd scolded us for wasting history, and put everything back into the mailbox at the diner, with a note for the editor at the local paper: "For your records, call me." The week that followed was small and methodical. I practiced how to look calm while my tongue tasted like metal. I wrote emails that were plain and not theatrical, and I arranged for 2 things to happen simultaneously: an internal audit request sent anonymously to the bank, and a viral post plan seeded through a friend at a food blog who owed me for a favor years ago. I didn't tell Laura everything. I told her enough to let her brace, and she smiled at me with that particular tired kindness that said she trusted me but that she also feared what I was about to do. The second section began where the first left off, no neat exhale, because humiliation has a momentum, and I had turned it into a tight, deliberate machine. The family kept on with its life, setting small tables and small apologies, while I cultivated a quiet storm. The rise of the plan was a series of small explosives. A screenshot leaked to a local blogger showing Derek's chat about selling the Riley recipe bundle. A voice memo I had transcribed and sent anonymously to every board member of the Catering LLC. A friendly post in a neighborhood group that asked, with more innocence than I'd ever felt, "Anyone else notice the Riley pie in the grocery chain?" And then the thread where someone posted the scam partnership agreement and highlighted the unanimous consent clause and asked, "Wait, who signed off on this sale?" Like a domino set I had laid myself, these small knocks toppled structure. Derek's friends called him, cross and confused, and at first he laughed it off in the office, a smear, as men do when the first light hits the bluff of their reputation. But the internet has teeth, and my screenshot of his bragging, "Mark will never see this coming," made the rounds because a food blogger with a lot of followers loved the drama of stolen recipes. She amplified it with a piece about family brands being swallowed by corporations, and suddenly our town's dinner table had a comment thread with strangers weighing in. Derek's PR smoothed at first. He posted a polished statement about business decisions and family transitions, and his voice in the video was steady. He even tried to sell his humiliation as triumph, leaning into the applause from certain relatives who preferred the company of a man in a suit. But my quiet administrative nudges had already done legal work. The bank froze the transferred funds pending confirmation because the buyer noticed the incomplete documentation and flagged an inconsistency, and an auditor's email asked to see notarized assent for the sale. That small, bureaucratic pause was the tightening noose, procedural justice beginning to hum like a machine in motion. He called me once, breathless and coated in hurt. "Mark, why?" And I didn't answer with fury. I answered with the calm ache of someone who had had enough. "Because the ledger doesn't lie," I said, and he spat. "You think screenshots and doodles make you a martyr?" And I thought about how the blue tin sat in my closet now as both relic and tool. The second quotable line rose in the quiet corridor of my mind as I walked past the office to get to my car. "You cannot outrun the receipt of your deeds." The tension crested in small public ripples. Derek's name hovered in an article about family brands, and his business partner, an eager man named Alan Whitcomb, who had been part of the purchase, started to ask questions about indemnities and warranties that Derek had glossed over in a meeting where he was drunk on his own future. Derek began to crack under the scrutiny because the game he had played required secrecy, and secrecy is a fickle mattress under a man who sleeps with one eye open. The town hall invitation came. Derek was to be given a Community Leadership Award for his recent philanthropic gestures, a medal presented on Saturday in the municipal building, a stage, in other words. Tom called to confirm he could run the AV for that night, and I asked nothing heroic, only that Tom set a laptop on the podium and keep one microphone open and one light on the side screen. The plan was surgical, and at its heart lay a theatrical reveal that would use the public's own appetite for spectacle against the man who had weaponized his family name. I tested how to keep my face unshaken when YouTube clips and screenshots started to spin rumors. I set up a burner email that would send the entire packet of scanned documents to the county clerk with a note. "Please verify signatures per section 12.1. And then I sent a quiet message to the editor at the local paper with the blue tin's contents scanned and curated. The social thread thickened. One of Derek's friends posted a selfie with him and the caption, "Proud of my brother," and the comment thread beneath it became a battlefield where strangers posted links and asked for explanations. The thing that had been private, the sale, the messages, was no longer digestible in whispers. In the days leading up to the award night, I watched Derek at the grocery store, hands in the pocket of his coat, an expression of a man who'd convinced himself that reputation is armor. He smiled at a neighbor, and the smile felt brittle to me, constructed of necessity. I rehearsed my lines in the car, not to shout, but to be clear, as if preparation were a kind of sanity. My wife asked me once while we loaded our coats for the haul whether this would hurt Emma. She asked because she saw the scoring in my eyes. I told her, plain and without flourish, that it would hurt, but that it would also end. "Men learn slow," she said, and handed me the blue tin like a priest passing a relic. I thought of the third quotable line then, which rose like a flare. "Justice remembers how the small things were traded." The nights were thin. My sleep had the jerky cadence of someone waiting to spring a trap, and the days were busy with emails and the small civilities of a man pretending everything was normal. When the Saturday came, the municipal building smelled of polished wood and cheap coffee, and the hall filled with people, old neighbors, civic volunteers, a smattering of reporters' eyes, bright with the predictable pleasure of watching someone they know be honored. Derek's laugh filled the room like a loud, confident bell. He took the podium to applause, accepted the medal, and spoke about community and vision in the kind of language that presses the right buttons for civic organizations. Tom gave me a nod from the back, and his fingers tapped the keys in a rhythm only he and I understood. The blue tin sat beneath my jacket like an ember. The camera in the hall recorded the event live, and my plan moved through its gears. At the moment, Derek lifted the blue tin because I had volunteered to bring dessert, and because volunteerism is a brilliant disguise. Tom hit play, and the projector on the side screen lit up with the screenshots and the audio clip. The very voice memo Derek had sent where he laughed and said, "We cut Mark out. He won't notice." And the room did what rooms do when they swallow a truth. It inhaled and didn't exhale. The screenshot of the chat artery slid up across the screen, and the live feed went to the blogger's account who had picked it up earlier. The camera spilled the image onto the internet, and a dozen phones lifted automatically to capture it. Derek's mouth opened like a gull's and then closed. His face flooded red, and people murmured, and then the murmurers found sentences and voiced them. That projection alone might have toppled him in a normal life, but I'd built procedural justice into the trap. Minutes after Tom's fingers opened the file, an email that had been pre-sent to the county clerk popped up on the screen. The clerk had replied, "We need notarized consent for the sale. Current transfer lacks signature per 12.1. A legal clerk in the back of the room, who had been present because civic awards often attract clerks and minor officials, stood, reviewed a copy, and read the clause aloud. There it was in black and white. Any transfer required unanimous written consent and notarized signatures. Failure to obtain them rendered any transfer voidable. Derek's Johnny shoulders dropped because he realized the paperwork he had waved through had a hole the size of a hand. I saw his partner Alan's expression shift from smile to knife edge and heard the first gasp, that small animal sound a crowd makes when they realize reality has teeth. The viral clip spread like a ring in water. People in the back seats hit their phones and streamed it to friends. Comments exploded. I felt my heart thump like a fist against a loose board as Derek's smooth talk unraveled into shrill denials. He reached for the mic and stammered, "That's those out of context." But the visual proof sat on the screen like a god with no mercy, and the clerk's quiet words, "This sale is under review," were as good as a sentence in the civil court of public opinion. I let the spectacle do its work because spectacle is how towns decide where their sympathies lie. But even as the audience turned, I was mindful of how to keep the ending clean and just not dramatic and dangerous. The digital exposure had done its bite. Derek's recorded messages, his sell-off chat, the screen grab, each proof found mirror and audience and multiplied. I had used the town's own apparatus, its expectations for transparency, its fondness for civic ritual, to make the moment public and irreversible. The partisan who would have defended him found it hard to do so when the media's lens was live in the hall, and the partnership's clause, that small technicality, began chewing at the foundation of his claim like a miner's pick. The third section's trap tightened until the man who had thought himself king of a family brand found his court a courtroom. I watched Derek be unraveled by both the internet and the minor official who loved rules enough to insist on them. His undoing was both social and procedural, and together they were the twin hands that pried open whatever stubbornness remained in him. The fourth quotable line nudged me then, sharp and true. A man's arrogance is only as steady as the paper he signs on. When the projector went dark, and the applause turned into something like pity, Derek's voice sank into the wood-paneled hall, and he stepped down from the podium, a man who had been stripped not by a single brutal act, but by 100 small truths arranged the way a surgeon arranges instruments. The contract clause did its legal work. The county clerk, the paper's editor, and the AV operator had all now seen the same set of documents, and they began, one after another, to set the processes that would force Derek to answer in a way that was more formal than a family row. In the day that followed, the local paper's online headline asked the question, "Riley recipes sold. Was the family not consulted?" Derek's phone blew with angry calls and messages, and in the middle of the storm his partner Alan called to say the buyer was pulling back until legalities were settled. He'd assumed the buyer wanted to close now. The buyer had assumed due diligence was clean. The buyer found the clause and said, "Hold." The traction of bureaucracy is merciless. Its pace is glacial, but its logic is irresistible, and Derek had forgotten that rules are built to bite at small oversights. I watched him crumble in the newspaper photos, more wounded than criminal-looking, and I felt a tight, complicated relief that was not triumph so much as the end of a long calculation that had to be exact to be fair. But the final twist wasn't merely legal. The double twist was coming, and with it the symbolic object that had been a quiet witness would return in a way that left no doubt about poetic justice. I had kept one thing for last. The blue enamel pie tin held more than evidence. It held a revelation meant for the very public place Derek most wanted to claim his reputation as a generous benefactor. Derek tried to salvage his image by arranging a charity luncheon to give back, under the name of Riley & Sons' new brand, a move designed to shift narrative and win hearts through pancakes and speeches. He believed the public would forgive if the spectacle was big and warm enough. He chose the community center, and he wanted the pie to be the centerpiece. He asked for the blue tin as a sign of his return to tradition. I agreed and brought the pie in with a smile that did not reach my eyes because the last act of my plan was surgical and, yes, merciless in its truth. When Derek raised the tin to cut the pie and show everyone his charity had the family's blessing, the blue lid came off, and instead of the golden pecan lattice he expected, People saw a sheet of paper on top with the scanned, notarized copy of the partnership agreement and the highlighted clause, and beneath it a printed screenshot with Derek's message blazoned across the top. The room went quiet, and then the AV, because Tom had other keys pressed in the back, flicked on and played the recording of Derek's voice that had been on the memo. "We cut Mark out. He won't notice." Derek's face drained the way a portrait loses color when the frame is lifted. The community center's camera streamed to the local blog, and within minutes the charity luncheon became the punchline of 1,000 retweets. The symbolic object, Grandma June's pie tin, the thing she had used to gather us around tables across decades, became the carcass that held his undoing. The very tradition he had tried to exploit to claim virtue had become the stage on which he was unmasked. The procedural justice did its formal duty. The county clerk's review moved forward, the buyer backed out, the partnership was re-evaluated. But the social justice hit harder. Derek found himself excluded from councils that had once smiled on him, invitations dried up, and the community's small kindnesses evaporated like breath. He was undone by the combination of a dry legal clause and the messy, beautiful power of a community that refused to be fooled. The final quote that rose in me at the peak of the reveal was simple and unadorned. "You can hire a lawyer to write contracts, but you cannot hire eyes to forgive." I did not dance on his ruin. Revenge in my head had never been a stomp on a fallen man, but the precise return of what had been taken: his reputation, his easy exit with the brand, his ability to co-opt a family story for personal gain. When the dust settled and the cameras left, there was one last thing I did. I walked up to Derek, who was gray and small and looking like a man who had been stopped at a border and never let through, and I placed the blue pie tin on the table between us. His eyes met mine like two doors closing, and he asked, voice small and raw, "Why?" I answered plainly, and the lesson I gave him was not poetic. You betrayed family for money. You paid the price. Learn to read what you sign. It was plain, 2 sentences that contained a life lesson not aimed to wound but to instruct, American, practical, and hard-earned. And then I turned away, the tin cold beneath my hand and the smell of pecan and molasses rising like a memory, and walked out of the room with my daughter waiting at the edge of the folding doors, her face solemn and curious. I left Derek with the knowledge that both the law and the people he sought to manipulate had found him wanting, and as the hall's lights dimmed, I felt the complicated scarring of a man who had exacted justice without becoming the monster he feared. The last moments were not a neat cinematic fade, but a living cessation. I had been humiliated, and I had engineered a public undoing that felt like precision anesthesia, and the town would talk about it for months in the way small towns do over diner coffee and on the highway, in the bar where men count their losses and on bleachers after a game. I walked to the car with Laura and Emma by my side and did not say much. The lesson sat heavy and clean in my chest. The final plain truth I left with Derek and anyone who would listen was short and practical. Don't trade family for fortune, and keep your receipts. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.